Wir haben in der Konferenzplanung überlegt, mit welchem Event wir die Konferenz beschließen sollen. Zur Auswahl war ein Feuerwerk oder der Vortrag von Professor SCHUEFTAN. Wir haben uns für die wirkungsvollere Variante entschieden. Professor SCHUEFTAN, darf ich Sie höflich um Ihren Vortrag ersuchen?
Kann ich bitte hier Licht haben? Ein bisschen mehr Licht auf dem Tisch? Licht? Ja, wenn möglich. Wenn nicht. Kann auch ohne. Okay, in conclusion, we've heard a lot about willpower, and I think the willpower to listen to a lecture at this time in the afternoon is the utmost that we all need, but I think I've already mentioned it here, that I would repeat what Henry VIII said to all of his 6 wives. I won't keep you for very long. So I will try to discuss will, but to focus not only on the will of the leaders, which is very interesting, and I will say a few words about it, but also on the very complex relationship between the will of the leader or the leadership and the will of the people. In other words, it's very nice that you're a leader and you have a lot of will, and even if you have a lot of power and a lot of will, but in modern times, since the Napoleonic times at least, we need also the will of the people. If you cannot relate to your own people, to your own group of solidarity, if you cannot convince people to follow you, then having a will is not very helpful. Now, of course, will is the crucial thing about practically every human enterprise. An achievement of human enterprise is, to a very large extent, a product of will. This is true about people who are very weak and rise to the top. This is true about people who have an excellent starting point. Think of Mozart. I think in Vienna it's only natural. It was the will of his father that made Mozart what Mozart was in the beginning. Later he had his own enormous talent, but the will of his father started it all up. But will is a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition. You can have a lot of will. If I, for instance, want to be a prima ballerina and I want it very much, I'm not sure I have the capabilities of doing it. At least recently I tried and it didn't work very well. But the question is, do you have will? Do you have the power to pursue your will? And the most important thing, since the Napoleonic era, at least, particularly when it comes to war, you need to convince your people to go in this direction. And this relationship between the leadership and the people is very complex because you need to be able to read your people. And there is no textbook you can learn it from. There is no academy you can learn it in. You need to have this Fingerspitzengefühl. I'm sorry that I have to use a word in German since I'm speaking in Hebrew, but as you may have noticed, the name of my lecture was in German, in spite of the fact that I'm speaking to you in English. Wo kein Wille, dort kein Weg. Oder vielleicht noch besser, wo kein Wille, da ein Ausweg. When we come to Europe, we will discuss this particular thing. There is very often a leader that does not read his people well. Let me give you 3 interesting examples. One is President Johnson. By the way, a great president when it comes to domestic issues in the United States. Perhaps the greatest since the Second World War, with the enormous contribution of the Great Society in America. How do we remember President Johnson? We remember him misreading his people on Vietnam. And this was the tragedy of a president who was a great president on domestic American affairs, and we remember him because he misread his own young generation and therefore did not run for a term of his own. Remember, he became president after the assassination of Kennedy, and then he ran against Goldwater and won, and for the second term in office he did not run because he realized that he lost the trust of his people. So here is one example. I have a very sad Israeli example, and many Israelis disagree with me. I think that Rabin misread the Israeli people. They assumed that he assumed that the Israeli society is weak, and therefore he must reach a kind of agreement with the Palestinians that he himself was very skeptical about. One thing, and I'm sure that if until now I did not create a kind of rejection in the audience sitting here, I think that Angela Merkel basically profoundly misread not only the German people but the entire Western civilization, and certainly the people in Europe, when they believed that all the Europeans want is to look good in their own eyes, because now the Germans can be the open-minded, the generous, the people willing to accept all others that have difficulties. And she created the extreme opposite of what she wanted, because she brought about the opposing powers, and now we have a situation of polarization in Europe that is, to a considerable extent, a product of Angela Merkel misreading her own people. Now, when is will particularly important? And this is a combination, again, of the will of the leader and the will of the people. Now let me see if this works. It does. Unbelievable. Okay. Disregard some of the lower parts because it was confused. This is the first time in my life that I'm using PowerPoint, because as far as I'm concerned, you either have a point or you have PowerPoint. So this is the first time I'm using it, and therefore it's not very good. But the two first lines are very important. When is will very important? When the balance of power is impossibly against you, don't have a strong will. It will only lead to suicide. Here is a good example from the Second World War. You remember what Yamamoto said after the success, the enormous success of Pearl Harbor. He said, "We have woken up a sleeping giant." He understood that they may succeed in Pearl Harbor, and they had an enormous operative success in Pearl Harbor. But when it comes to the strategic balance of power, to see the whole structure, die große Zusammenhänge, once you bring in the United States into a war, it's only a question of time until you're gone. And this is a mistake that many people in the military make. They look at tactical or operational successes, and they don't look at the strategic picture. Let me quote here something that I've learned from Moshe Dayan, some people here I'm sure have heard of him. He gave me a very good lecture about strategy, and it was very short. He said the difference between tactics and strategy is the following. If you get a young woman into bed, it is a tactical achievement. If you get married to her later, this is a strategic catastrophe. So we need to have the distinction between the success of an operation and between the success of the overall enterprise. And if the balance of power is impossible from your side, don't even try. Now, the Jews have also a traumatic experience with Bar Kokhba, because he rose up against the Romans and he had enormous successes, and the Roman Empire had to invest enormously into fighting him. But you don't confront the Roman Empire. And if you're a responsible person, you don't confront the Roman Empire. We've just heard yesterday from Professor Meissner the kind of thinking that you had in this empire, but it's huge, it is ruthless, and it cannot afford to let the Jews show that the Romans are incapable of succeeding in a war. So it is suicidal in this case, as people in Nagasaki and Hiroshima can tell you, and as the Jews who were exiled for 2,000 years from their country can tell you. So don't have a good will, don't have a strong will, if you are in an impossible balance of power. But if the balance of power is prohibitive, in other words, the only way that you can bridge over the fact that you are weak at a time, then the power of will is enormously important. And again, take the very interesting cases in the Second World War to demonstrate it. First of all, you have Britain in the time of the Blitz, okay, without America. At the time, it was not clear if you can bring America into the war. Once America is in the war, then the balance of power looks very differently. But the British were not sure that the Americans will come into war. Remember, Roosevelt was elected on a ticket of not drawing the United States again into a European war. So here, the will of Churchill was tremendously important. And let me remind you, we assume that Churchill was the only option that the British people had. It was not only Chamberlain. Remember Halifax. Remember the discussions inside the British cabinet. So it could have gone in a different direction. In the beginning of Barbarossa, also, the balance of power was prohibitive, and the tremendous will of Stalin and the will of the Russian people, and we will come to it later, the fact that Stalin did not only use his oppression in order to bring the Russian people to fight, but he also used something that was genuinely there. This, to a very large extent, decided the war. An Israeli example, in the summer of 1948, it's very difficult to understand the 1948 war. In the beginning, the Jews were very, very weak. At the end, the Jews were very, very strong. I'm speaking about the early times of the war. In the summer of 1948, the battle for Jerusalem, were it not for the unbelievable will of the Har El Brigade, and here it's only fair to say that the same Rabin that made the mistake in 1993 was the commander of the Har El Brigade and showed enormous will, but military will and political will are different, and Rabin was very good on the first and not very good on the second. Another example. Now, when you come to reasonable balance of power, will is important but not crucial. It is crucial, it is essential when it is prohibitive, and it's desirable, it's nice to have when it is overwhelmingly in your favor. But remember one thing, in recent decades, huge powers confronting minor opponents also need a will because they have a problem with their own people. Because people are not willing to fight, and people are not willing to die, and people are always finding good excuses why the bad guys are good guys, because we are not perfect. Okay, there is this focusing on the imperfections of the good in favor of the evil of the bad. This is a distortion of recent decades in Western societies. So today it is not as simple as in the Second World War or during the Roman Empire. You need to have other considerations, and this is the second part that I want to speak to you about, namely what happens in different regimes, because we've had a lot of discussion here during the week about willpower, but I don't remember, maybe this was the time I took a coffee break, but I don't remember any of the lectures making distinctions between different regimes and different societies when it comes to will, and I can think at least about three kinds of regimes: authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, democratic regimes, and something that, for want of a better term, I will call post-historical regimes, namely Europe. I'll come to that in a moment, but let me start with the authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. Now, here is an interesting thing, and I'm speaking about the relationship between the leadership and the people. And two examples that I can give in such regimes are Stalin, that I've already mentioned, investing enormously into strengthening the will of his own people, and it was there. There was a very strong element of strong will in the Russian people anyway, but he insists on building it with a very strong educational effort, not only relying on oppression. Oppression was there, but it was relatively in second place to mobilization. His mobilization of the Russian people during the Great Patriotic War, to use the term that is used in the Soviet Union, is very, very impressive. So it's interesting that you even in an oppressive regime that can use oppression, you use oppression as a secondary element, and the first and most important element is mobilization. Another interesting example from the Middle East in the Arab world is Gamal Abdel Nasser. Gamal Abdel Nasser, the ruler of Egypt from 52 or 54 until he died in 1970, was a very impressive person. And he managed to mobilize the will of the Arabs, let me use a phrase that Nasser himself coined, from the ocean to the Gulf, namely from the Atlantic Ocean to the Persian Gulf. Practically every Arab was motivated very, very strongly by the personality of Nasser, and the only thing he had was will, because the Arab world was a backward part of the world then. It is a backward part of the world today. If I want to be polite, let it call it developing. There are euphemistic ways of speaking of nations that are backwards, but so let's call it developing if it makes anybody more happy. But in Nasser's time, the only thing that made Nasser a major player in international relations was his enormous will and the enormous stupidity of the United States. So when you combine the two, Nasser saying, "Fear me, I'm great," and Eisenhower saying, "Oh, let's be careful, he is great," or Kennedy being very wrong on this issue again, and instead of burying Nasser, as he could have done very easily, and with the Soviet Union with him, he comes to help him in 1962 in the Yemen. As long as Nasser had the will and the Americans had the stupidity, it worked very well. Will could determine everything. And then came Johnson, and he said, "Who is this Nasser?" And they told him, "Oh, be very careful, he will be angry." And then he said, "Okay, if he will be angry, what will he do to us? Who's afraid of the big bad Nasser? I mean, we're the wolf. He is not even a piglet, okay? Who's afraid of the big bad Nasser? There is nothing behind him except smoke and mirrors." And the moment the Americans said, "You are nothing, nothing," Nasser became nothing. And it was fascinating to see. I've written a book about his 3 last years, from 67 until he died in 1970, and I must admit, I'm a person who enjoys revenge. I'm sorry, I know that when you listen to Mozart, you can sing "Nichts ist so hässlich als die Rache." I love it, I'm sorry. So writing this book was fascinating because you see him dying of a broken heart, because his will no longer produced anything when real power came and said, "Who are you?" Okay, it reminds me of a great story, and I actually know the person who did it. You know that a ship of war is in a position to demand that that any other ship identifies itself. It has to say what ship. So an Israeli torpedo boat was in the Mediterranean, and it saw an aircraft carrier, and it signaled, "What ship? You know, you have to identify to us." And the Americans didn't answer for a while, and after a while they answered, "Where are you?" I mean, they couldn't even see the Israeli ship. So this was Nasser in the world scene. Here is the United States, and Nasser says, "What ship?" And once the aircraft carrier realizes that it's an aircraft carrier, it says, "What are you fishing boats out there, and what are you?" And he was finished. The moment his will was shown as the only thing he had nothing else but this particular will. Let us now turn to democracies, and this is very interesting again because you can juxtapose not only what we have already done, namely juxtaposing Churchill to Chamberlain or to Halifax, but also something very interesting like Barack Obama. Barack Obama prided himself of having no will. In other words, of abdication. Now, if you are a small power and there is a bigger power on your side superseding you, you can abdicate. The British, after the Second World War, abdicated, and Tony Blair even used a very nice term we used to be Rule Britannia. I hope you all know the song, Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves, Britons never, never, never shall be slaves. We used to be Rule Britannia, and now we're Cool Britannia. That's fine as long as you have the United States. I mean, you have somebody else to give the baton to. But when the United States abdicates, like during Obama, you're giving it to the Chinese, and the Chinese are not even ready. They're basically telling you, we are still using the American world order in order to become rich, so let's have a few more years of American world order before we take over. And Obama simply wanted to go home. And by the way, so symbolically, and I'm surprised because Obama was aware of symbolic acts. When the United States had 9/11, the British people gave the President of the United States a bust of Winston Churchill to put in the Oval Office of the White House. And the day Barack Obama came to the office in January, he not only removed it from the Oval Office, which is reasonable, I mean, everybody puts in the Oval Office what he wants, he returned it to the British people. He made a gesture of saying, thank you, I'm not a Churchill, I'm an Obama, which I think is very, very true. If there is an antonym to Churchill, it is Obama. If there is an opposite to Churchill, it was Obama. A nice man, by the way, but nice men shouldn't be presidents of the United States. So we have a very interesting case where this is how his presidency started. And let me tell you something about how his presidency ended. It ended with an interview to Jeffrey Goldberg, one of the finest journalists. The fact that there is a fine journalist, that it's not a contradiction in terms, always surprises me. Some journalists know what they're doing. And he was very close to Obama, and Obama gave him an interview, 76 pages in the Atlantic Monthly. A fascinating, if anybody of you did not read it, you should, it's fascinating. And in there, what is Obama proud of? He says, my number one pride is that I did not follow through when I drew a red line and then I withdrew from it. So taking the worst decision of his presidency and being most proud of it and getting rid of the bust of Churchill really defines his presidency. So if we want to know what is a non-leader in democratic societies, or if I may use a term much more insulting, a European leader in American decision-making, here you have Obama, and I will come to Europe a bit later. I think Israel is a good example of a society where on the one hand you have a very democratic regime, and on the other hand a strong consensus when it comes to the will on major issues. I'm sure it's not the only example, but that's an example I know very well. And now I come to what I consider to be the most fascinating and the most depressing. And this is what I call post-historic society. Europe had so much history. Now it's tired. It doesn't want to be in history anymore. Is it all of Europe? No. Are there major distinctions in Europe? Yes. Does it represent all the peoples in Europe? Certainly not. But it represents elites, and these elites have managed to persuade consecutive people in government to pursue this attitude of what I call post-historic. And here the problem is not only losing the political will in terms of strategic issues and military confrontations and so on. It is something, in my view, that is much more fundamental, namely what Schopenhauer calls das Wille zum Leben. And I'm coming back to a discussion we've had here yesterday, a fascinating discussion that we had here yesterday about births, about the number of children. People who have so few children have a problem that is much more fundamental than strategic questions with their will. It is das Wille zum Leben. It is something much, much more fundamental. And I think that we have a major problem not only on the attitude of Europeans vis-à-vis other societies, we also have a problem inside Europe, and we have a problem of translating the perceptions of victims should not be required to have any kind of responsibility from the social sphere to the international sphere. You don't expect responsibility from people in the third world. They have been victimized. We've had colonialism. We're guilty. And because we are guilty, whatever they do is great and whatever we do is wrong. And let us feel guilty and we will be happy and live happily ever after. But let me go to the roots of the problem, and I don't think you can have political will, you don't have strategic will without it, and this is the question of solidarity. When you can have a political or strategic will, you need to rest on something that is real. And the question is, what is the group of solidarity that you really care about? That you can speak as a leader, that you can speak in the name of? Is it a real group of solidarity about people who care about each other? Or is it something that you ideologically fabricated and convinced yourself that it would nice to have and therefore it exists? Now, on the question of is it nice to have, I disagree with most European elites, and it's a legitimate disagreement. On the question if it exists, I can tell them very clearly, it doesn't. The only thing that exists is national solidarity. But national solidarity in Europe has been, to a very large extent, by the elites I'm speaking about, undermined and delegitimized. Because if you are patriotic, you're probably hiding the fact that you're actually chauvinistic and you're on the way to becoming a fascist, because there is a slippery slope, and we've seen it in the 1930s and the 1940s, and therefore you delegitimize patriotism and you delegitimize nationalism. And if you delegitimize patriotism and nationalism, and by the way, I'm not saying there is no fascism and there is no danger. There is a danger, but by giving up nationalism, you promote fascism, because there is a dialectic relationship between going too far in one direction and finding yourself going too far against your will in the other direction. The only antidote to fascism is healthy nationalism. And if you want to fabricate something called European solidarity, maybe one day it will come along. I'm not saying that one day it is impossible. What I'm saying is today it is not strong enough to substitute nationalism. You can today create a European solidarity based on peoples working together, on national sentiments working together to produce a super national solidarity. This can be done very slowly, very carefully, realizing that you're not there yet. But to pretend to cheat yourself as if there is already a European solidarity group is dangerous, because then you believe that Europe is a power. And once Europe comes on the world scene and pretends to be a power, it's a joke. Let me give you a specific example of what is happening. Europe is working with Iran against the United States, with Russia on energy, on gas, on Nord Stream 2 against the United States, with massive Chinese investments against the American world order, and then it comes to America and says, we are not willing to fight, we are not willing to invest in defense, come send American boys to defend us if and when we will be in trouble. And this doesn't work. Because you cannot have anything if you completely undermine and delegitimize healthy nationalism the way it is delegitimized in Europe today. Because the old traditional tribal, a traditional solidarity is no longer there, and I'm glad it isn't. The modern national solidarity is delegitimized. The European solidarity is not yet ready to take its place, and the universal solidarity is a supreme joke. So if you say, for instance, people suffer all around the world, and they're in danger, let them come to Europe, expect a few billion people to come, because there are billions of people who suffer terribly. And if you say they have a right to come, it produces a political process that inevitably brings up the right wing, the deep right wing, and the fascists. And it cannot be in any other way. This is not a very clear post factum hindsight. Okay? This could be seen in September 2015. This is what I said in September 2015 in Berlin, in the Kanzleramt, to the people of the National Security Advisor, that it is inevitable, that it must come, it cannot be anything else. And when you have no solidarity group, when you have nothing that you can rest on, you cannot have a political will. What is the political will of Europe today? Worse, I can tell you from the perspective of the Middle East, where the Europeans have tried to have a major impact and invested huge sums of money. What is the impact of Europe? Nada, gar nicht, zero, bobkes, nothing, absolutely nothing. What is the impact of Europe today on the world scene? The Europeans tell themselves stories about something called the international community that they are leading. They're basically doing what the non-aligned countries say to them in the United Nations. It has no meaning whatsoever. Because there is no will of Europe, because there is no Europe, because there is no solidarity group. And if we don't do that, I don't think we can progress having a will. Let me conclude by saying what I think is wrong on the left side of the spectrum and what I think is wrong on the right side of the spectrum, and unfortunately we don't have enough in the middle of the political spectrum. I think this is the problem. What is wrong on the right side, on the left side of the spectrum? We basically discussed when we discussed the elites in Europe, because we are not only speaking about something that is not functional, we are also speaking about denying reality. But what is wrong with the right wing of the spectrum is that the response to one dysfunctioning system is another dysfunctioning system. Because if you go to the kind of nationalism that Poland or Hungary is going to today, you will also not be able to be functional in the new modern world where you have to go beyond the boundaries of one country. The solidarity group can be Polish, but it must be a part of a broader solidarity group. When your choice is between letting every immigrant in and not even trying to protect the culture of the people who live in a certain place, then you lose their trust, and then they vote for people who offer them an extreme version of "we are the only ones that exists." and anybody else is illegitimate, and pluralism is being undermined. So between these extremes of, on the one hand, having Europe led by an unelected leadership, which the EU is to a very large extent, and what is happening, again, a good example is Poland and Hungary today. The question is, can you come back to the middle of the political spectrum of a society that has a strong national solidarity, a willingness to fight for something that they believe is theirs and they identify with, a willingness to spend money to have a real army. To give only one example, in Europe you have today between 1 and 1.25% spent on defense, even by countries who have armies. These armies are not functioning very well, to be extremely polite, to put it this way. The Americans invest 4.5%. Okay, this gives you an order of magnitude of what can be done in democratic societies. Israel spends today 5.5%, but for a very long period of time, when we had immediate existential problems, for a very long period of time we spent 23% of our GDP on defense. Is it healthy? No. Is it good? No. Was it absolutely necessary? Yes. Is it necessary today? No. But the Europeans spend practically nothing. And they don't educate their people in a way that finally a leader can come and say, I have a will, and this will is supported by my people. I'm not just standing there as a very strong person, I have behind me a very strong society. And the last word, I think it is obvious, but let me say it anyway, is that all of us who pursue legitimate objectives should be extremely careful not to become purists. In other words, to believe that there cannot be too much of a good thing. You can have too much of a good thing. For instance, transparency is a good thing. Today, transparency reached a point where nobody speaks to the subject, everybody speaks to the protocol, where nobody cares what will happen to the next generation, everybody cares what happens in the next week, and transparency went too far. Is transparency good? Yes. Have we seen progress over a long period of time? Yes. Do you want a strong defense system? This is easy to say in Europe. Yes, but do you want the army to control your society? No. So the question is not the maximum of what you believe in, but the optimum balance. All these values are legitimate, and the real question is not, is this good or that bad? Both can be good and bad. The only question is, where is the balance between the two that optimizes the ability of people to be at the same time strong enough to oppose external pressures and soft enough to want to defend what you're defending against outside aggression. When they ask me about Israel, what is the number one challenge of Israel, I keep saying, and I think this is true about others as well, can we have a system that is a Sparta on the outside and Athens on the inside? And where is the point where you balance it? Can you, because you must be tough as nails against your enemies, and at the same time as soft as you can be to your own people inside your society? I think the Arabs have a problem in being Sparta both on the outside and the inside, and the Europeans have a problem of being Athens both on the inside and on the outside. And I think the only combination that is also represented by a will, because you need the will for two things. You need them in order to build a very good society inside, and in order to do whatever it takes in order to defend it from outside enemies. So the question should be not what is the maximum, but what is the optimum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for your very clear political, strategic, geostrategic, wise and also on words. Thank you very much. I will open the floor for questions from your side, please. First, and then.
Dan, thank you for this lecture. Just a humoristic remark. I know what you want to say. I know, it doesn't work well. I know what you want to say using the term Athens for the inner side of Israeli society and also for the outside of European societies. Well, it is largely the Athens that is depicted by Pericles in his Epitaphius. Now, the reality in the eyes of people living in the Aegean in the 5th century would have been quite different, I think.
Yes, I'm aware. Thank you. I'm aware of the fact that the term Athens and Sparta, or particularly Athens, does not reflect ancient history, and I was hoping that nobody was sitting here who knows it, but it's a catchword of what the perception is of Athens, having learned, among others from you, why it is not. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for your remarks. Just one thing. You say Obama was so nice to be the president of the United States. But I can tell you, for the time being, in the word we've got, I would like to have Obama. Why? As the president who is complying with the law, with general agreements, instead of having such a president like the Twitter president, who is withdrawing with a lot of agreements, such as one dealing with Iran, and one every day using the policy of escalation instead of the policy of de-escalation. Thank you very much.
I will be the last person to defend the personality of Trump, but when it comes to being a president, and you can imagine that if they ask me what is the dream president of the United States that I have, I wouldn't say Trump. But the question that a president is somebody who is very difficult to like, if it is at all possible, shouldn't have an impact. Obama was a very nice person as a president, and I'm sure he is a very nice person today, and I would like to have him as a friend, as a neighbor, as, I don't know, a lecturer here in this seminar, very intelligent person. But the President of the United States has an objective. You know, in 17th century, I believe it was, that, and if there are better European historians here than me, please correct me if I'm mistaken, that European leaders, European kings used to add to their title Defendor Fide, Defender of the Faith. The President of the United States is ex officio Defender Liberty. Were it not for the Americans, all of us would live in bondage. Okay? It is the power of the United States and the will of the United States, of the American people and the American leadership that gave freedom to the world. Is the United States perfect? No. Did it do many things that I don't like? Yes. But you need to look at the overall picture. And this role of being the leader fighting for liberty is something that Obama did not embrace. This was not part of what he was. I have a problem in the United States. If I were an American, I would vote Democratic on domestic issues and Republican on foreign policy. Since my field of specialty is not abortions but world affairs, The best president the United States had, in my view, since the Second World War was Richard Nixon. The combination of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger was the best possible. Who got us into Vietnam? Kennedy. Who took us out of Vietnam? Richard Nixon. Now, would I want to have him as a friend? No way. As a father? No way. But I'm not shopping for a father or a friend. I'm shopping for a president. And on Barack Obama, I can only say something that, again, I learned from Moshe Dayan. This was a term that he used very often. He said, this is a good guy in the bad sense of the term.
Any more questions?
Yes, thank you very much for your brilliant analysis of the status quo in Europe. I am not 100% sure about your analysis on Poland and Hungary. It may also be a kind of reaction to what they're experiencing from their European neighbors, a sort of Trotzreaktion. And they have managed to get their birth rates rising. They're being attacked on these politics in very impolite ways. And for example, political correctness has gone so far in countries like Germany that even if you're Israeli, in Germany, there would be people who would call you a Nazi. We have lost all marbles when it comes to communication and decency. And my question to you would be, how to get back on track?
How what?
How to get Europe back on track when it comes to, at least a solid state of mind?
It is trying to contain our instinct to answer one extreme with another. Okay? If you take, for instance, the authorities that the courts have in Western Europe, I think it's too much. But do I want to go to the Hungarian side? No way. Because practically there is no independence of the Hungarian judicial system. So if you ask what is the way, when I'm furious with political correctness, actually I enjoy it, because I enjoy being politically incorrect and having people curse me and telling them what I think of them. But when I'm furious with the idea of political correctness, I don't want to have control over what I say from the other extreme of the political spectrum. So what I'm saying is, try to find the optimum. And by the way, we're not very far from it. I think we strayed from it. It must constantly change. I'm not saying, here I have the golden rule and this would stay forever. Let it change, but let it change without breaking the combination of resilience and freedom, security and liberty. This is the challenge. This is what democracy is about. It is constantly debating over where is the balancing point and changing it with the agreement of the society. Let me give you an interesting example. Look at the attitude to homosexuals today and 50 years ago. If somebody would have asked me 50 years ago, do you want the present attitude to homosexuals that I very much support, I would say we are not ripe for it. Take it a step at a time. Don't do what is right, do what is digestible. Okay? You need a broad society. You don't want a few radicals to be pure and everybody else to feel that they're doing something immoral. You want to bring the whole society, not the whole society, okay, most of the society, the mainstream of society with you. So digestibility is for me a very important guideline.
One last question, Commander Kodner, please.
I admire the courage of people now to ask questions, because other people may cause bodily harm to them later.
You mentioned the song Rule Britannia. There were two versions written in the 18th century. The other one was about a fine young man who falls overboard to the bottom of the deep blue sea. He actually marries a mermaid, but that's another matter.
Okay.
Chorus.
That's
My point.
I learned the other song too, and I'll sing it in the Albert Hall. This is where, you know, once a year people come together and sing stupid songs. So I always enjoy coming there.
Well, on the subject of stupid songs, given the situation in the United Kingdom at the moment and what you've said about Athens and Sparta and Macmillan saying that we were the Greece to America's Rome, how the hell can we get out of this mess? What's your recommendation?
I think the best way to understand what's happening in Britain is to realize that all democracies are in crisis. I mean, look at what is happening. I mentioned it in another lecture that I gave here 3 days ago, that I came to the US Congress a few months ago, and I told them all my life I was looking for a political system more dysfunctional than that of Israel. Thank you, America. Okay? You have it today in all democracies. They don't function well. Will democracies find their way out of it? Yes. But we went from the extreme where everything was done in the darkness to a system where everything is done in the open. I want more of a balance there. The system of who gets elected into politics. Who wants to be a politician today, seeing what they do to politicians. The moment you're in politics, there is a whole bunch of wolves, not only in the media, but throughout, in the judicial system, in the whole society, that is destined to destroy you because you're not perfect. Okay? The only thing where people have reached perfection is perfect idiots. Okay? I'm not looking for perfect people. And if you look at who is standing, I mean, look at what the choice was that was given to the American people. 350 million Americans could give them the choice between Trump and Hillary. Okay? It's unfair to the American people. We are all democracies. We are in trouble. And the reason is we don't understand that there can be too much of a good thing. Things that worked very well for all of us, and I'm delighted we went to this direction. We reached a point today where in the Western world a woman can destroy a man's life by saying, "Me too." And she doesn't have to prove anything, and it can happen 40 years ago. And everything, and the system doesn't know how to deal with it, okay? So, did we have an unacceptable reality before? Yes. Am I delighted that we are fighting against it? I'm the father of 3 daughters. Nobody has to preach to me about it. But did we go too far on this, on transparency, on many other things? Yes. And you can't have governance unless you come back to the balance in the middle of the political spectrum.
Thank you very much, sir. It is up to me to say a big thank you for your outstanding presentation. We are already familiar with that. We expected that. We were convinced you will be as brilliant as you always are. And above that, I want to say a big thank you for your input to the conference, for establishing high-ranking international contacts, which fosters our external appearance and visibility. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, Herr General, bleibt mir nur mehr über, die Beendigung der Konferenz 2019 zu melden. Ich darf mich den Worten des Kommandanten bei seiner Einleitung anschließen, indem er gesagt hat, der Erfolg dieses ganzen Unternehmens ist maßgeblich bedingt durch Ihre Mitarbeit als Vortragende, als Panelleiter, als Panelisten, als Diskutierende. Ihre andiskutierte Meinung fließt in den Konferenzband ein und wird damit sozusagen das geronnene Ergebnis des Ganzen, und wir kommen unserer selbstgesetzten Zielsetzung, eine Strategieentwicklungsplattform zu bieten, nach. Dafür recht herzlichen Dank. Ich wünsche gute Heimreise. Danke für Ihr strategisches Interesse und, um mit Wolf Labins zu sprechen, für Ihre strategische Geduld. Ein neu geprägtes Wort, das möglicherweise sich Eingang in ein neues Thema finden wird, und darf mich für Ihr Dasein bedanken. Herzlichen Dank.
Ich lasse Sie nicht gehen, ohne mich ebenfalls diesem Dank anzuschließen. Und ich möchte, nachdem er sich bei sich selber natürlich nur schwer bedanken kann, mich bei Brigadier Beistel bedanken, unter dessen Hand die Vorbereitung und Durchführung, aber auch natürlich die Nachbereitung dieser Konferenz durchgeführt wird, bei seinem Team, nicht nur aus der ÖMZ, sondern auch aus allen Bereichen der Landesverteidigungsakademie, die hier mitgewirkt haben. Ganz, ganz herzlichen Dank. Well done.